I will initially run a short presentation, basically to say that there's the 10th white paper that has come up, and starting from 1998 onwards, what is the thrust is what I have mentioned here in one slide. If you shorten it and see what are the thrust line in that particular paper, this is what comes across in the last about 9 of these papers. Starting from about 2010 onwards, it has become more structured and it has become more topical. Till about 2010, it was also very regular. Every alternate year in the month of December, they used to release that white paper. Starting from 2013 onwards, we found a delay. Instead of 2012 December, it came out in 2013 May. And similarly, 2015 again, there was a delay. It came on, I think, 24th of May, if I remember correctly. And this time, after a gap of 4 years, you found the next white paper coming up. The first question that comes up is, why is this delay of 4 years? Wherever I've spoken about this, the first question that people ask me is, was there something that delayed this white paper? To my way of thinking, the reason why probably they held back is the kind of reforms that the PLA military went into in 2015 November. If those reforms were to be taken into account for the next defense white paper, they should have waited for the reforms to stabilize to some extent and see how that reforms will lead to what they want to say in this particular white paper. Accordingly, one section of this paper, as I go to the next slide, you'll see, this white paper comprises of 61 pages and 6 sections. If you see the section 4, that gives the clear detail about the reforms in China's national defense and armed forces. So that actually lays out the kind of reforms which they announced in 2015 November and see where it has come so far. So that is the thing that they've given. In these six sections, firstly, I'm sorry, it's not internal security situation, it's the international security situation. That's my mistake. I probably typed it wrongly. Please pardon me for that. What happens is in this, there are 2-3 things that have come up in the first section. The first one comes up about, they talk about the cultural diversification and they say multipolarism is irreversible. That is the first point that comes across in that first section. The second one is US's unilateralism, which Dr. Manoj Joshi put it across. US's unilateralism and hegemonism is destabilizing the international situation, is what they have mentioned. And the third point that comes up is Taiwan independence movement is the gravest immediate threat to China. This is what they seem to be implying in section 1. In the section 2, they talk about the defense policy. And for ages, China has been saying that its defense policy is defensive in nature. So it is something which they propagate all the time, that our defense policy is defensive in nature. They also talk about peaceful reunification of Taiwan. At the same time, in the end of that particular place, they also say that we make no promise to renounce use of force for unification of Taiwan. There is a contradiction there, but again, there is nothing new. They have always been saying this, that we ask for peaceful reunification, but we don't rule out use of force, is what they have been saying earlier also. And so I don't see a marked difference or marked departure in their stance, which has been there earlier. The third one that comes up in this third section is the mission and task of China's armed forces in the new era. This is something that we need to focus here a little more. One is the details of operational achievements of PLA. They have laid it out in many forms. And then they've also talked about focus on space and cyberspace. And again, space and cyberspace is nothing new. Earlier also in the defense white paper, they have said instead of 3 domains, it will go to 5 domains. Army, Navy, the land, sea, and the air. And in addition, space and cyberspace were also included earlier also in the papers. So there's nothing new in that either. What is more interesting is the last point, the safeguarding of interests of diaspora, organizations, and institutions. If you look at the 2015 white paper, you also had a mention of the expansion of role for the PLA. Similar one has been made here. The expansion further being, they have actually quantified this by saying diaspora, organizations, and institutions, etc. So this is something that It's an expanded role for China's PLA. So this is the third point that we need to look at as far as this is concerned. In the fourth section, reforms in China's national defense and armed forces, they have actually given the details of the ongoing reforms, and they have laid out that path of 2020, 2035, and 2050, which corresponds to the earlier pronunciation in the reforms process. Basically, by 2020, they want the mechanization and the information technology issues to be completed. By 2035, they want to complete the modernization of the PLA armed forces. And by 2020, they want to have an armed force which is capable of winning wars at the global level. So that is the three-stage process. This is a deviation from the earlier three-stage process. In 2008 white paper, they had given a three-step process. And that three-step process was, the first phase of the modernization was to be completed by 2010, the second phase by 2030, and the third phase was to be by 2050. So there is this little shifting of the timelines, but however, the 2050 timeline of having armed forces which can win global wars is something which has remained constant. The other thing is on the defense expenditure. They have tried to justify in this section that the defense expenditure is justified and it stays well below the 2% mark. It is an open kind of a budgetary allocation. It is transparent, reasonable, and appropriate. I've mentioned all the words which have actually they have mentioned to justify the defense expenditure. But we all know that the defense expenditure is not fully actually publicly announced. You find some amount of hidden expenditure which is always there in the defense budget, which is actually difficult to quantify. The last section deals with contributing to building a community with shared future for mankind. The shared future for mankind is again being propagated over a period of time. You find that the armed forces, their contribution to UN peacekeeping, their contribution to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and anti-piracy roles have been highlighted in this particular segment. And in the annexures, they have given a number of annexures below this paper. One of the annexures gives the entire functioning of the CMC. They have given various offices, commissions, what do they function. The functioning has been given in detail, which is actually a good guide for us as to know who's doing what in the Central Military Commission. And there are other annexations which give the details of exercises and other things. So these are good data points for us to work on in case anybody is watching China closely. So what is the analysis? I have just put an analysis because analysis can be in many forms. So this is my analysis. First analysis is, the first point is, I think almost all the analysts missed this point. Everybody talked about China blaming US for hegemonism, etc., etc. I thought the key word was the configuration of strategic power is becoming more balanced. And this has got relevance to what Dr. Manoj Joshi said about earlier, talking about the new type of major power relationship. And if you read the new type of major power relationship, I won't have the doubt which you had. They clearly indicate that the new type of major power relationship is between China and US, and basically no conflict, cooperation, etc., is being talked about in the new type of major power relationship. And that, of course, like he said, the Americans didn't bite it. They never mentioned it. They didn't accept that particular concept at all. Here, what it implies, the configuration of strategic power is becoming more balanced, which seems to imply, and I haven't seen any analyst writing about this, it seems to imply that China has arrived. And this power is getting more balanced between China and the US. That seems to be the implication of this. He also talks about Russia is increasing its capabilities for strategic containment. This is a bit of a surprise, basically, given the kind of relationship they have with Russia. If you are telling that Russia is actually building up capabilities to do strategic containment, that is something that we need to take note of. The third one is security of individual countries is becoming increasingly intertwined, interlinked, and interactive. This is something they seem to indicate that they follow a foreign policy which they state as a friendly neighborhood policy, which will probably be saying that, okay, all of us are interlinked as far as this is concerned. South China Sea is generally stable, and combine that with the next one, justifies building infrastructure and deployment in South China Sea and Tiaoyu Islands. Basically, they're trying to justify their construction of infrastructure in the 7 reefs which they have reclaimed to the point that it is our territory. South China Sea is generally stable, and we are building basically this for freedom of navigation and overflight and assisting people in navigating is what they say. So evolution of warfare from informationized warfare to intelligent warfare. This is something that we need to take note of again. Uh, this has been mentioned twice in this paper, once here and once in the next chapter, the fourth chapter. The next chapter also they have mentioned it. There, what it implies is the informationized warfare, when it transforms into intelligence warfare, what it implies is artificial intelligence being used in a big way along with informationization to get it more intelligentized. So this is the intelligentized warfare that they are talking about. And lastly, China upholds freedom of navigation and overflight is what they have said in this paper. So which is fair in the sense that they've always been mentioning this, and the doubt with others who are doing other countries do seem to have a doubt about the freedom of navigation and overflight, but they have always been mentioning that they uphold the freedom of navigation and overflight. As far as Taiwan is concerned, they talked about peaceful reunification. They talked about one country, two systems. They also talked about no promise of non-use of force, which I mentioned to you earlier. And that implies clearly that they have both. They put out both, and it is ambiguous to keep the ambiguity going. But my reading is I think they look for peaceful reunification because the other one has got a lot of other implications. China hasn't started a war is something they say in this paper, but that's why I put 1962 under question mark, which they always claim that it is a counterattack. So that's why they don't say that they have started this war. So, but that's the way I put that question mark there. The next point is active defense. Active defense is something which has run through common in all the defense white papers as well as in their pronunciations of their strategy. And the active defense strategy comes from not in the recent past. It comes from Mao Zedong. He talked about active defense for the first time, and thereafter till today, active defense seems to be the thread that runs common in all the defense white papers and in all their pronunciations of their strategy. Active defense, if you want to decipher in simple one-line deciphering is, I don't have to wait for the enemy to attack me to defend. I can preempt it if I can, and that will act as active defense. So that is simply put what active defense is all about. The People's War, again in all the papers you will find People's War. Why I have put that People's War here is basically because the connotation of People's War is changing. The People's War, as we saw in, say, Long March or in Korean War or in 1962, etc., that is not the kind of People's War they're talking about at this point in time. The difference that is, they expect the people to support the war. Previously, they expected the people to go and fight the war. What the differentiation now that they do is the local governments, the people, etc., are expected to support the war effort. So that is something that shift that has taken place over a period of time. A no first use nuclear policy, they have mentioned it this time also. In 2013, they did not mention this word, and it created a lot of ruffle. So people started questioning whether there's been a change in the stance of the NFU, etc., etc. Ultimately, the spokesperson in the Ministry of Defense had to clarify that they continue to follow the policy of no first use, which they have also articulated in this particular white paper. And the third thing on the Doklam incident, they have said that the PLA is working hard to maintain peace in the Doklam area, which I thought probably was a softer form of saying what happened in Doklam. They wanted to soften it. It appears that seems to be the case. Another interesting phenomena which they have mentioned here is the cyber sovereignty. Now, cyber sovereignty is something which nobody is able to define so far. How do I define a territory which is in cyber as mine? So that is something which they seem to be thinking that cyber sovereignty is possible, and they seem to be advocating that. But the world is actually divided on this opinion of cyber sovereignty because you can't define a territory for cyber. And lastly, PAPF, and why I put the data there, it is interesting to see this. He says PAPF has done a wonderful job, and they have neutralized 1,588 violent gangs and 12,995 terrorists in Xinjiang. So this is something they seem to be propagating, that the people who are in Xinjiang have been, Xinjiang is affected by terrorism, and there are so many terrorists that they have been able to neutralize. Work allocation of a CMC is something which I mentioned earlier in the annexures, and that is a good thing. That is something that it's helpful for people who actually look and study Central Military Commission and its functioning. The justification of defense expenditure, I explained to you earlier. They have gone out of the way to justify the defense expenditure that they have. And they also mentioned something as a founding member of UN. In one of the chapters, one of the sections, they mentioned that they are the founding members of UN, which is, the take is different basically, because then, then you'll have to decide when did China become PRC, and then when did they get into UN? Those are different questions to answer, but they seem to be saying that they were the founding members of UN. Overall, my analysis of this was, I think this paper was put out basically to justify China's actions to some extent, in the sense that what they are doing in UN, what they are doing in defense expenditure, what they are doing in South China Sea, it seems to be an effort to justify what China's actions are. And the second thing is also her anxiety about China-US relations is visible in the first section very clearly. Third is India-China relations are shown in a bit of a positive tone, and the concept of intelligent warfare is something that we need to take note of and keep studying as we go along. So I'll stop here, and if there are any further questions, I'll take it during the question and answer session.